Well, good morning, everyone. I hope you all had a good Mother's Day weekend during this COVID crisis. I'm John Levy. It's my great honor to serve as the 10th chair of the board of the Legal Services Corporation. And on behalf of our board, welcome to this important virtual briefing on how civil legal services are addressing domestic violence issues during this unprecedented COVID-19 pandemic. We'll be privileged to hear remarks this morning from four distinguished members of Congress: Susan Brooks of Indiana, Debbie Dingell of Michigan, Gwen Moore of Wisconsin, and David Price of North Carolina. North Carolina's remarkable Chief Justice Cheri Beasley and LSC Leader Counsel Co-Chair Harriet Miers, a former White House counsel and partner at Locke Lord, will also deliver remarks. Our briefing features a panel discussion among LSC grantees around the country and a magistrate judge, all experienced in dealing with the legal issues surrounding domestic violence. It will be moderated by LSC's President, Ron Flagg. A sharp increase in domestic violence is just one of the many legal challenges LSC and its grantees are facing during this pandemic. Just a few weeks ago, before the pandemic erupted, 59 million Americans qualified for civil legal assistance because they were living at 125% of the federal poverty guideline or below. As we know, coming out of the last recession, that number grew to 65 million Americans in 2012, and that is when unemployment grew to near 10%. Well, seeing last Friday's numbers that unemployment is now almost at 15% and may well rise in May to 20%, really depression era levels, we have to assume that the number of individuals who qualify for civil legal assistance may well jump to 80 or even 90 million. And just last year, when the number of qualified individuals was so much lower, LSC conducted an intake census of its grantees and found that 42% of the legal problems presented received no service of any kind. That 4-week study also found that only 27% of eligible problems presented were served fully because of a lack of resources. Well, these numbers tell the story only of individuals who knew to come to our grantees because they understood their issue to be a legal one. But studies continue to show that many qualified low-income Americans do not even recognize their problem as a legal one, and thus do not seek assistance, either forfeiting their rights or attempting to navigate the system on their own. We also know from past recessions that there will be a huge increase in the kinds of matters that many low-income Americans deal with. In addition to domestic violence and abuse, they fight unlawful evictions and foreclosures, struggle to access health care, seek unemployment insurance, and fend off scams and unscrupulous debt collectors. And to make matters worse, LSC grantees will likely face sharp cuts from state funding resources. As the Federal Reserve necessarily lowered interest rates a few weeks ago to near zero, interest on lawyer trust accounts, IALTA, will surely plummet, and that source of state funding for civil legal aid will likely drop by as much as 75% or more. In 2018, IALTA programs provided $65 million to LSC's grantees, over 5% of their budgets. And other sources of state funding, like filing fees, will also be challenged. We're very grateful to Congress for recognizing the significance of this crisis and awarding $50 million to LSC and its grantees during the recently enacted CARES Act. And we hope to receive another $50 million in legislation now under consideration. But as you can see, such funding will barely allow grantees to hold their own. This morning, we focus our attention on one of the major issues the clients of our grantees are facing in this pandemic, domestic violence. LSC grantees handle a large volume of domestic violence cases every year. Just last year, nearly 137,000 cases where domestic violence was a significant factor, the highest number of such cases recorded since LSC began collecting this data in 2011. These numbers will clearly spike during the pandemic as, sadly, domestic violence typically increases under the kinds of health and financial stresses many Americans are experiencing, with tensions exacerbated by the isolation associated with COVID-19 prevention efforts. Children home with remote schooling will often witness such violence in the home and may themselves be the subject of abuse. We're already seeing evidence of this increase in domestic violence. Police stations in and around Pittsburgh report a 62% increase in domestic violence calls. In Orange County, they're up 25%, and here in Chicago, nearly 15%. On behalf of the American people, we have a responsibility to call attention to the seriousness of this issue and to do our very best to make sure that our system of civil justice is fairly accessible to our fellow countrymen, irrespective of their economic means. Just a week and a half ago, we observed the 62nd Annual Law Day, first established in 1958 by President Dwight D. Eisenhower, who in his proclamation called upon us to, and I quote, vigilantly guard the great heritage of liberty, justice, and equality under law, which our forefathers bequeathed to us. Well, we at LSC are committed, as I hope you all can see this briefing demonstrates, to do our part to heed President Eisenhower's stirring call. Well, thank you very much for joining us this morning, and let's begin the program. I'm introducing our president, Ron Flagg.
Thank you, John. I'm Ron Flagg. Today, I have the pleasure of introducing Congresswoman Susan Brooks. Congresswoman Brooks has represented Indiana's 5th District since 2012. She co-founded the Access to Civil Legal Services Caucus in 2015 with Representative Joe Kennedy, and she is a true champion for LSC and of equal access to legal representation for low-income families. As a standing member of the House Energy and Commerce Committee and former chair of the House Ethics Committee, Congresswoman Brooks has advocated in part for improvements in mental health services, biodefense, and public safety. Prior to serving in Congress, Congresswoman Brooks served as U.S. Attorney for Indiana's Southern District and spent more than a decade in private practice. She also served as Deputy Mayor of Indianapolis for 2 years. We are grateful for how she supports the legal aid community in Congress, and we have been privileged to partner with her on many occasions, including our opioid task force. Congresswoman Brooks, again, for joining us.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for the opportunity for me to come during this incredibly difficult time in our country's history and be a part of this. And I'm really proud to have co-founded with my good friend Joe Kennedy the Access to Legal Services Caucus. We're proud that it has grown, and with Joe and I both leaving the House of Representatives at the end of this term, you know, it is very important that we bring as many people into this discussion as possible. And I think the work that you all are doing is even more important, and representatives all across the country need to continue to understand and have a better understanding from us and from you what you're doing in your local communities. So while these weren't in my remarks, I would encourage you to consider reaching out to your own representatives wherever you might represent and make sure they know about the services of LSC and all of the incredible work you're doing now. I've been asked, because this is specifically focused on domestic violence, we know that millions of Americans, as John just talked about, they experience domestic violence each and every year. But we know that stress can also be a significant contributing factor to domestic violence incidents, whether it is increased domestic violence against a partner or whether it is child abuse. And we know that while this COVID-19 has brought tremendous uncertainty for so many of our neighbors, one thing that we know is happening is domestic violence. In fact, in Indianapolis, I represent northern Indianapolis and 8 counties to the north. It's an urban, suburban, and rural district. So I have actually my district, Central Indiana, is a bit of a microcosm of the country. But according to Indiana University, Purdue University, and Indy, domestic violence calls have increased in Indianapolis. Research that came into, which I thought IMPD did an interesting analysis, this research after schools began to close and when our stay-at-home order first went into effect in March 23rd, they compared that with calls from January 1 through March 16th. Domestic calls did increase about 22% in Indianapolis during that period of time. An average of 73 calls per day in Indianapolis rose to 89 calls per day a week after schools closed. Tragically, we also had a horrific incident where we lost a young 24-year-old police officer. She was responding to a domestic violence call just a few weeks ago. And I attended an incredible funeral service that was held for Officer Breanne Leaf. She was only 24, a young mom, and the perpetrator shot at her through the door. They were doing everything by the book. And I think what I have read and what I know is that he was experiencing some significant mental health issues at the time. But we did honor her out at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, had an incredible service in her honor, but I think it certainly reminds our community of the incredible dangers that law enforcement is facing responding to domestic violence calls, particularly now. As it wears on and stay-at-home orders continue, even though we're beginning to slowly reopen, many states are still at significant stay-at-home orders. Our state has moved into stage 2 of reopening. We know that many victims are scared to leave and they're scared to stay. So there's tremendous fear on top of the fear they already have. We also know that it's not uncommon for abusers to isolate their victims as an act of control or to reduce their opportunity to disclose the abuse. And now with home cameras becoming so much more popular, victims can become even more isolated and can be monitored even more by their abusers. So with all of this amazing technology we're now taking advantage of, we know that abusers can even use that technology to really monitor either the outreach by phone or by computer of those being abused. And we need to recognize that. And so it is a huge concern. I recently signed on to, actually led a letter with Rodney Davis of Illinois and Ann Kirkpatrick from Arizona, calling for, you may or may not realize, but the VAWA Violence Against Women Act, it has been allowed to lapse, unfortunately. And so it is not reauthorized right now. There is still funding that the Justice Department has. However, we do need to reauthorize VAWA. And we have asked for that to be included in the next pandemic response package, because we know that it provides grants to your communities across the country, whether it's for first responders, sexual assault nurses, domestic violence centers, victim advocates, counselors. Those are the types of funding we need to make sure that VAWA is in this next package, and I'm going to continue to advocate for that. I also signed on to, and I will tell you that 115 members in a bipartisan basis signed on to that letter. So that is a really significant, I think, a significant letter that we led. It will show our leadership that this is a bipartisan issue.
Yeah.
We need to get VAWA reauthorized. I also signed on to a letter with 5 other members asking for the additional $50 million that John mentioned for legal services. And I think now is the time for many of you to let your own members of Congress and senators know the critical important work that you are providing. I know that in the first 50 million that we provided, millions already got out to the your different organizations across the country to increase the telework capacity and to try to make sure that you have the resources you need as all of you work from home. I think additional funding is going to be critically important as our neighbors receive more and more eviction or foreclosure notices, as they go through challenges with or without health insurance, as they, and particularly for those victims who are trying to reach out to the courts relative to domestic violence. Law enforcement, this is National Law Enforcement Memorial Week or National Police Week. And so I always like to remind folks about the important roles they are playing right now, and that some officers are giving their lives as they are responding to these domestic violence and child abuse calls. So I want to thank you all for being that resource for clients who may call you for help, who may call and ask you to connect them to the resources they need, whether it is shelters, whether it's counselors. Now that connection to legal services is more important than ever. And so want to thank you for shining that light for members of Congress. I'm going to do my part, Joe Kennedy, and though the other members, David Price and others who are going to come on the call, we're going to try and make sure that our fellow colleagues know how important it is, the work you are doing. So thank you for giving me this opportunity, and I look forward to listening as long as I can to the rest of this conference.
Thank you, Congresswoman Brooks. I believe Abby Kuzma is now on the line and wanted to add her greetings.
Right, yes, absolutely. And wonderful to hear you, Congresswoman Brooks. And as everyone can hear from her words, she is so passionate and effective in working with, as a tireless advocate for those suffering from domestic violence, sexual assault, and human trafficking. And this is true in Indiana as well. And in fact, I was blessed to work with Congresswoman Brooks when she formed the first task force in Indiana to fight human trafficking. We owe her a great debt for all she's accomplished. And again, you can hear her passion on the phone. Just thank you so much, Congresswoman Brooks. It's a blessing for all of us to be working with you.
And that your strong voice is going to be that, you know, strong Hoosier common sense. Let's get some good things done and protect our fellow citizens. Thank you. Absolutely.
Thank you. Thank you both. And now John Malcolm, a distinguished member of our board.
Oh, fantastic. All right. Well, my name is John Malcolm, and I'm a member of the board of directors of LSC. And so actually, while I'm hiding out in North Carolina's 11th district, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Congressman David Price, who represents North Carolina's 4th district. Congressman Price serves on the House Appropriations Committee and the House Budget Committee, is chairman of the Transportation, Housing, and Urban Development Appropriations Subcommittee, and he also serves on the Subcommittee on Homeland Security and on the Subcommittee on State, Foreign Operations, and related programs. Before his election to Congress in 1987, Congressman Price was a professor of political science and public policy at Duke University, and he's authored 4 books on Congress and the American political system. He's also received numerous awards, including being named a lifetime champion by the North Carolina Justice Center, which, among other things, provides legal services to low-income families. Congressman Price, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks for those kind words. And I'm sorry for the delay in getting on here. This seems like every conference has a slightly different set of hurdles that one has to clear. So so here we are, and I'm glad to be on with my colleague Susan Brooks and Gwen Moore, and of course with Sherry Beasley, our Chief Justice from our North Carolina Supreme Court, Tiandra Miller from Legal Aid of North Carolina, and a good lineup. So since we're running a little late now, I will be brief, but I do welcome the chance to say hello to you and to commend you for your good work and to wish you a successful conference. As Susan was saying, we're all getting reports of increases in domestic violence, child abuse in these difficult times. Our Compass Center here in North Carolina is experiencing an increased demand, up 15% from March of last year in survivors seeking supportive services, and up a stunning 116% in requests from survivors seeking emergency housing. I just got off a call. We have every other day we have staff debriefs, and this call this morning featured a discussion of a case with regard to these direct payments, where you know, the direct payments go out through the IRS. In the case of a separated couple where there had been serious abuse, the woman in the couple had made that known to the IRS, but nonetheless the money came through entirely to the abusing spouse, and he's not going to share it. And so we need to, of course, track this case down. But that also tells me that in this next CARES bill, we need to make sure that there's an opportunity to give notice in a situation like this, and for those direct payments that are desperately needed, of course, to many people, for those direct payments to go to whom they should go to. So a lot of problems and a lot of challenges, and not least of which, of course, is adequate funding, also an issue in this next CARES bill. Adequate funding for violence against women, and also for legal services. I think Susan probably mentioned that in the first bill there was $45 million for critical emergency shelter through the Family Violence Prevention and Services Act, $2 million for the hotline. $50 million, should have been a lot more, by the way, but $50 million for legal services in the CARES Act. They very quickly have distributed that money to their grantees, including our own legal aid in North Carolina. So we're now working on CARES Point 2, or 2.0. We know that legal assistance has to be part of this, and so we need to get an accurate assessment of the need and plug that into this bill, and hopefully move on this bill within maybe this week, get it formulated this week, and then pass it with by next week. That's the challenge, and we know that that this needs to be a part of it. This need isn't going away. This is a prolonged crisis. None of us have ever been through anything like this. But I know that many of you and your organizations are responding to the need, are rising to the occasion, and that's what we need to do. And we in the House of Representatives and the Congress need to understand that that we need to be present and accounted for in terms of support, financial support, also the kind of casework we do. All of us are involved in casework by remote, from remote sources these days. But these cases are coming in. We're still having to deal with these matters. In fact, more such problems, and so it's wonderful to have the women's centers, also the legal services operation, of course, that we can refer people to and work with locally. So thank you for the chance to greet you and to be part of this. I too will stay on as long as I can and look forward to hearing what everybody has to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Congressman. We're next joined by Frank Nooner, a distinguished member of our board.
Good morning. My name is Frank Nooner, and I serve on LSC's Board of Directors. It's my pleasure to introduce Chief Justice Cheri Beasley of the Supreme Court of North Carolina. Chief Justice Beasley began her judicial career as a district court judge in Cumberland County, where she served for a decade before she was elected to the North Carolina Court of Appeals in 2008. She served as an associate justice on the Supreme Court of North Carolina for 7 years before she was appointed to lead the Supreme Court and the North Carolina judicial branch of government, which has more than 6,500 elected officials and employees in 102 courthouses. She's the first African-American woman in the Supreme Court's 200-year history to serve as Chief Justice. As Chief Justice, she advocates for a court system that solves legal disputes and helps people better their lives. By engaging local judges, educators, and law enforcement, she helps to reform discipline in schools and keeps kids out of courtrooms. She supports expanding specialized treatment courts that better serve the needs of North Carolina children and families. And she works to leverage the power of technology to make North Carolina courts efficient and accessible. Please join me in welcoming and thanking Chief Justice Beasley for being a part of our program today.
Thank you so much, Frank, and thank you so much for having me. John, it's good to see you as well as you, Ron. My Congressman David Price, it's great to see you. And Congresswoman Brooks, thank you so much for all of your work and support on this really important issue. It's been my responsibility as the Chief Justice to make sure that our courts have been accessible during this pandemic for the most emergent issues. And I have been in touch with Chief Justices from all over the nation, and we've all got the same concerns around making sure that people have access to courts, while on the other hand, we are largely reducing the foot traffic in our courts because we want to do our part in reducing the impact of COVID-19. In North Carolina, we are the 9th largest state in the nation with a population of roughly 10 million people. And we have a unified court system, which all court systems do not have. But I hope in some way that makes my orders a little bit easier to interpret. However, all the local jurisdictions have their own administrative orders, which are largely consistent with mine. In North Carolina, there are 4 kinds of cases that even through the pandemic we are hearing, and certainly domestic violence cases are one of those kinds of cases. It's been really important to me to make sure that our courts are available for the most emergent needs. And we certainly know that, as we've already heard, that during this period of time especially, courts must be available for people who are experiencing domestic violence, especially in their homes. In North Carolina, just like in much of the rest of the country, domestic violence filings are actually down, even though, as you've already heard, the calls to hotlines have increased tremendously. So we do know that there are folks who are living in crisis. And while the stay-at-home orders that have our executive orders by our respective governors around the nation have been entered in order to keep people safe, we also know that home can often be a place that is not safe for people who are experiencing increased domestic violence. We also know that since children are not in school right now and they're being schooled virtually through their homes, that domestic violence for children or child abuse filings and petitions around abuse, neglect, and dependency are down. In great part because those reports often come from doctors, they come from social workers, they come from teachers and educators and a whole host of folks who encounter young people every single day. And so we're very concerned about the fact that we want to make sure that families who are in the greatest needs are receiving supports. We do have, even though one can have their domestic violence cases heard actually in court while we are observing domestic violence, social distancing at this time in our courts, and there are very few cases being heard there. We also have an e-courts civil domestic violence system, which allows, even before the pandemic, for victims of domestic violence to go to family justice centers across the state of North Carolina to make their filings. And in many of those areas, those cases can be heard through our telecourt. And so there's audiovisual equipment that's being used to help people. Victims don't even have to go into courtrooms even before the pandemic to have those cases heard. And so we're excited about the fact that we at least had that technology up and running before the pandemic began. And as a part of the pandemic's impact, I have made sure that we have changed and made way for alternate ways for service of domestic violence protective orders on perpetrators to make sure that we don't have to rely on the U.S. mail and service can be accomplished. We're also excited about the fact that we are able to allow for language access needs either in our courts or through our telecourt system for domestic violence, and those services are still being provided. We have large military communities in North Carolina, and our population of roughly 10 million people. We have roughly 1 million veterans and also active service persons. And so for the two counties that have the largest numbers of active service persons, we are especially considerate around the fact that not only do victims need the access to be able to file domestic violence protective orders, also to have the hearings done, but also to make sure that those families have wraparound services, stable housing, and other kinds of resources that courts and domestic violence advocates are providing for those families. And unfortunately, in North Carolina, we know that there is at least a slight uptick in domestic violence homicides. And so we have to be ever present and mindful that we must provide resources for families who are all experiencing the greatest needs. And as I speak with chiefs from around the nation, we're all grappling with how to make sure that we can make those resources available. I'm excited that by the end of 2020 in North Carolina, about 50% of our population will have access to electronic filing through our courts, through our e-court civil domestic violence system. So Congressman Price is right. We need more funding for domestic violence programs, but we also need more funding for courts to make sure that we can truly allow greater accessibility in our courts, but also technologically allowing access to domestic violence victims all over the nation. So I thank you so much for the opportunity to be here and to share with you today.
Thank you, Chief Justice Beasley, and for your leadership as well. We will now turn to our panel discussion on domestic violence and the response of legal aid and the courts to domestic violence. Our panel today includes 4 legal aid lawyers and 1 judge, another judge, on the front lines of responding to the domestic violence crisis. Let me introduce our panel. Chief Judge Wanda Dallas serves as the Chief Judge for the Magistrate Court of Clayton County, Georgia. She oversees the court's administrative duties as its CEO, as well as sitting as one of the full-time judges in court. Sarah White is a senior attorney in the Clayton and South Fulton office at Atlanta Legal Aid. She manages a court-based family violence project in Clayton County, Georgia, and represents survivors of violence in family law, housing, and public benefits cases. Katie Aldridge is the supervising attorney of the Milwaukee Family Law Unit for Legal Action, Wisconsin. She and her team partner with the Sojourner Truth Family Peace Center to help domestic violence survivors secure protective orders. Juliana Lee is a supervising attorney of the Supporting Families Work Group at the Legal Aid Foundation of Los Angeles. She manages 2 court-based domestic violence clinics and leads the foundation's family law and domestic violence practice. Finally, Tiandra Miller is managing attorney and director of legal aid of North Carolina's Civil Statewide Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault Project. She manages the legal advocacy and strategic vision for project attorneys who are in 20 local offices throughout North Carolina. We have all been asked to stay home to help stem the tide of the coronavirus. But for those who experience domestic violence, home might not be a safe place to stay. We've heard some statistics. I'll add a few more. In 2019, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention reported that about 1 in 4 women and nearly 1 in 10 men have experienced contact sexual violence, physical violence, and/or stalking by an intimate partner during their lifetime. Today, our panelists will discuss how the coronavirus is aggravating incidents of violence. We'll also discuss how civil legal aid providers, judges, and court administrators continue to serve domestic violence survivors during the pandemic. We're going to start from the West Coast with Juliana. Tell us, please, how has the pandemic affected domestic violence cases in Los Angeles?
Hi. Well, this has really been an unprecedented and extraordinary time. Even before all this, Los Angeles County had the highest poverty rate in the country at 17%. As of last Friday, California's unemployment rate will be 18% compared to a peak of 12.3% during the Great Recession. And since March 12th, more than 4.3 million Californians have filed new claims for unemployment. So the heightened stress and anxiety people are feeling is palpable, and particularly acute for our clients who were already living in poverty. The pandemic has been described as the perfect storm for surges in domestic violence. So survivors are stuck at home, perhaps the most dangerous place for them, and they're stuck for much longer stretches with the person who makes the home dangerous. And everyone is incredibly stressed out. So the physical with the social isolation have disrupted all the usual methods survivors use to gather knowledge, access resources, and use social networks to safely leave an abusive relationship. So whatever their plans were pre-COVID, those aren't going to work anymore. But leaving is often the most dangerous moment in a domestic violence situation because that's when lethality concerns spike. Domestic violence survivors are also in special need of assistance right now because the coronavirus has done the remarkable trick of making their impossible dilemma worse. So at any time, they face a choice between losing the health and safety that a home brings, shelter, food, and some stability for children, and remaining vulnerable to ongoing abuse and the resulting damage and injury to their physical and emotional and mental well-being. The coronavirus has ramped up both. So the costs of giving up stability have skyrocketed, and so have those of vulnerability to now elevated incidents of abuse, which, according to law enforcement in Los Angeles, as of Friday, are up as much as 50%. So in these ways, domestic violence is also different from other legal issues. COVID has caused a spike in evictions, unemployment, and need for public benefits. Requests for legal assistance with such matters exploded early and remain high. Domestic violence was already an epidemic before COVID and has only worsened. But because domestic violence survivors risk so much by leaving, we were not surprised to nonetheless see a lower number of calls early in the pandemic. But as word has spread that the court remains open for restraining orders, that housing may be available for survivors, and that legal services are accessible, survivors are calling our hotline to file restraining orders those calls have steadily increased. So just one example, we recently assisted a client with a domestic violence restraining order where the abuser exploited the pandemic and shelter-at-home orders to amplify his abusive behavior. Knowing that the survivor and the children were taking necessary measures to abide by orders, to stay at home and reduce exposure, the abuser flaunted precautions. He kind of ostentatiously came and went needlessly, refused to wash hands, engaged in unnecessary touching, and all this just to cause distress. This was not the worst of the abuse, far from it, but it did deprive the survivor and her children of a key benefit of staying in the home, shelter from the pandemic. Without that reason to remain, the survivor made the courageous decision to leave, call our hotline, and file for a restraining order.
Thank you, Julianne. We're going to take a short break from the panel and turn to Congresswoman Gwen Moore, who has just joined us, and to introduce Congresswoman Moore, Julie Reskin from our Board of Directors.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. My name's Julie Riskin. I'm a board member, a client representative board member on the LSC Board of Directors. I want to thank everyone for being here to listen to this really important briefing, and thank, of course, our essential workers at LSC and all of the grantees. I'm very honored to introduce Congresswoman Gwen Moore, who represents Wisconsin's 4th District, which encompasses the greater Milwaukee area. Congresswoman Moore is a lifetime advocate for low-income people, for the communities that we represent. Since she joined Congress in 2004, she's been a champion for historically low-income and discriminated against communities. As a member of the House Ways and Means Committee, she worked to prevent predatory lending in minority neighborhoods, which is a huge issue, advocated for living wages and affordable housing. Even before she joined Congress, Congresswoman Moore served in the Wisconsin State Senate and the State Assembly for more than a decade. She also worked as an organizer for AmeriCorps Vista, and she was awarded the National Vista Volunteer of the Decade for her work establishing a community development credit union, offering grants and loans to low-income residents. Congresswoman Moore, thank you so much for your decades of work on behalf of our communities and for joining us today.
Well, let me say that I am so happy to be here with the Legal Services Corporation. And throughout my entire career, and I mean back in 1988 when I first joined the state legislature, I've always known legal services, the Legal Services Corporation, being that last stand of our institutions. And I've always felt so guilty about engaging in these conferences and calls and meetings, because I know that there's someone getting evicted, someone who is not being represented, someone who is very vulnerable to lack of services in our system because of the work that you guys do for the neediest people. So I want to thank you for all that you do. This is a premier services, and unfortunately, the need for it is even greater now during this pandemic. And I was able to catch some of the discussion from your panelists earlier. And I thought about a domestic violence situation. A man killed his whole family. And it seems like my daughter and everybody else I know knew the 14-year-old that was killed by his father and the whole family during this pandemic here in Milwaukee. And that is why I've joined with so many of my colleagues to try to make sure that we get $100 million in the next package for family services and prevention services, that we get $50 million in the next supplement for victim services and support services, and then $100 million for VAWA. And you know, with $55 million for family and for FIPSA, $200 million for VAWA stop formula grants. in addition to that, and $20 million each, breaking that down for culturally competent services to make sure that the services that are provided really fit the situation. I'm thinking right off the top of my head, the unique needs of communities like tribal communities and families that are mixed status, immigration status families. So there are all these culturally specific programming that needs to be done. And we just need to resource people up. I mean, people are, safer at home is an oxymoron to some extent, because you are not safer at home when domestic violence is present. Thank you for this forum.
Thank you, Congresswoman Moore. You are not safe at home is the watchword for our panel, and we'll reconstitute our panel. When we broke, Juliana had just described the effect of the pandemic in Los Angeles. I'd like to go around the rest of our panel to get brief reports from around the country, starting with Tiandra and North Carolina.
Good morning. I would just like to piggyback on some of Juliana's comments. We are seeing similar statistics in North Carolina. In fact, although there had been a dip in some of the civil filings, our law enforcement officers have seen an uptick, not only in the murders, but domestic violence related calls. In fact, at a recent task force meeting, they said there was a large percentage of those calls were directly tied to COVID type intimidation. For example, there's a situation like Juliana described where the abuser was using exposure to COVID as a weapon, and it actually resulted in some physical violence. And part of that violence is literally holding the person down and coughing in her face. And they're seeing a lot of those similar incidents as well. And so that, unfortunately, that's happening across the state.
Thank you. Sarah, can you give us a brief summary of what you're seeing in Georgia?
Absolutely. The Atlanta area has reported about a 15% increase in hospitalization, specifically due to domestic violence. We have also heard from our colleagues in Savannah in South Georgia. There has been the police department is reporting about a 33% increase in domestic violence calls, up from 9 per day last year, this time, to 12 a day. We have also seen in Clayton County, where we are practicing, an increase in the number of people who are registering to try to file for a civil protective order. It's up about 20% from what we would normally expect for this time of year. And it's also been anecdotally our experience that the vast majority of those applications are serious cases where they really do need emergency protective orders. I would also add that one thing that hasn't been mentioned yet, the closure of courts can lead to additional frustrations in ongoing cases, for example, divorce and custody cases, which of course a lot of our clients are in the middle of. And we have had some situations, for example, we had a client who was supposed to have a divorce already, but that hearing has been postponed several times now. And because there was no custody arrangement, there was a dispute over custody that resulted in her being dragged behind her current husband's car, and as a result needing a protective order. So those ongoing custody disputes that are really only exacerbated by the fact that they can't be resolved through the courts right now, through most courts anyway, end up in the domestic violence realm.
Thank you, Sarah. Katie, we've just heard from your representative, Congresswoman Moore. Can you give your perspective on what you're seeing in Milwaukee and southeastern Wisconsin?
Yes, thank you. So we already knew, as Juliana mentioned, that domestic violence was increasing prior to COVID in Milwaukee. Police calls related to domestic violence were up by 8% year over year from January 1st to April 1st. But during the first week of the quarantine, we saw a huge spike here in Milwaukee in police calls. They were up 28%, with referrals to the district attorney's office for possible charges up 15%. Since then, we've now seen a dramatic drop. Referrals to the DA's office have actually gone down 10%, and calls to the police department have also gone down. And I think Congresswoman Brooks mentioned one of the main reasons for that, which is the ability of abusers to very closely monitor the victims right now. It used to be the victim could flee to a neighbor's house or to a family's house and call the police from there, but that's simply not possible at this time. And another Congressman Price mentioned the lack of emergency housing. So victims have to consider, if I do this, where can I go? Where am I going to live with my children? In Milwaukee County, we've also been seeing a huge spike in domestic violence homicides. We've had 23 homicides from January 1st to present. 13 of those were pre-COVID. And Congresswoman Moore mentioned a tragedy we had about 2 weeks ago here, where one man killed 5 members of his family. 4 of them were teenagers. So since COVID, we've had 10 new domestic violence related homicides. Filings for restraining orders have also gone down, but that's because I think we are trying new things with the court closures, and there's a learning curve, and they are starting to pick back up. Thank you.
Thanks, Katie. Let's stick with you for the moment. We keep hearing about protective orders, and protective orders are one way for courts and civil legal aid attorneys to protect survivors. Can you give our audience a primer on protective orders and how can a survivor secure one?
Absolutely. And you're going to hear them called a lot of different things: protective orders, restraining orders, injunctions. And these are creations of state statutes. So every state, it's going to be different. Every state, there's going to be a different procedure, and every state, there's going to be different things you can get through the restraining orders. At heart, though, every protective order is essentially a no contact order. It keeps the abuser away from the victim, and through that removes the abuser from the home. And then different states are going to have, for example, in Illinois, they include children. In Wisconsin, we do not. The procedure for getting a restraining order is also going to vary state to state, and also from jurisdiction to jurisdiction within the state. So I'm going to talk about Milwaukee County because that's what I know best. It's where I've been doing this for the last 20 years. In Wisconsin, you first apply for what's called a temporary restraining order, which is a 2-week order. It can be, if granted, it's a 2-week no contact order, and it removes the abuser from the home. And it's done, the legal term is ex parte, but what that means is only one person participates in the hearing. So only the victim is going to the court and asking for this temporary restraining order. The court is not hearing from the alleged abuser at that point. 2 weeks later, there's going to be a full hearing to either a court commissioner or a judge. And here in Milwaukee County, we've adopted e-filing for getting the temporary restraining orders, which has been a big change for us. And I think, again, is part of the reason we've seen these numbers go down recently. But the actual hearing for a restraining order, a protective order, which can last generally up to 4 years, or in extreme circumstances up to 10, those hearings are still happening in person. It's one of the few hearings actually happening in the courthouse. And that is in part because we simply don't have the technology right now in that courtroom to do remote hearings. In Milwaukee, we have one courtroom that is completely dedicated to doing restraining orders. That's what they do 5 days a week, all day. In Wisconsin, if you have a hearing in front of a commissioner and you disagree with the result, so if whichever side loses, you have the right to request a new hearing from a judge. Those are called de novo hearings. And by statute in Wisconsin, those are supposed to occur within 30 days. However, obviously during the coronavirus, when the vast majority of cases are not being heard, those hearings aren't occurring. And they're just being adjourned and set out till whenever we hopefully reopen the courts. But what that means for a victim of domestic violence is if she didn't get the restraining order, the protective order that she wanted from the commissioner, now she has nothing. She's done this, she's gone to the court, she's exposed the violence, she's talked about it, which is often something that abusers threaten. You know, if you tell anyone what's happening, you're going to be really sorry. And now she has nothing. She has no protective order while she's waiting for who knows how long to be able to get a hearing in front of a judge. So that can greatly increase the risks for victims of domestic violence.
Thank you, Katie. Judge Dallas, we heard from Chief Justice Beasley. We'd like your perspective. Courts around the country have closed or altered their operations, and in some instances, survivors may be confused about whether courts can help them right now. What have you done to help ensure that your court keeps serving domestic violence survivors, and how did you work with Legal Aid of Atlanta?
First, I want to thank the coordinators of this conference. It's so important that we have these important conversations and that we can stimulate dialogue and interest in what happens to domestic violence victims. And in this season that we are struggling with getting information out and getting help to people, it's critical that they know where to go. So in Georgia, I've witnessed firsthand how my court had to alter our operations to address this pandemic. And so when our courts closed, our Chief Justice, similar to the Chief Justice in North Carolina, Chief Justice Beasley, closed the courts except for essential functions. And basically what we had to understand from the order is that essential functions involve criminal court arrest warrants. They involve first appearance hearings and domestic abuse temporary protective orders, similar to what we just mentioned about protective orders. And that's what magistrate court handles. So as it relates to the arrest warrants and the court proceedings, we immediately began to see an increase, as the other states have mentioned, in the arrest based on allegations of violence and abuse. And those cases are tracked through the system, and we attempt to assure that there are bond conditions to protect the victims. However, the challenge remained how to get the information to victims who did not call the police. And there seems to be this thread of victims being hesitant to come and report the abuse to the police. So how do we get the victim, the information rather, to victims so that they knew that the courts were available to assist them and that they still had some layer of protection? How to assist those to make sure that they knew that they still have access to courts. So even though the court was technically closed, the doors to the courthouse were open, and we still saw a constant influx of victims coming to the courthouse for help on how and where to apply for protective orders. Because before this situation occurred, victims would come to the courthouse. We had a victim advocate in the courthouse. Legal Aid was in the courthouse, and the victims could come to the courthouse and apply for temporary protective orders protection. And that was their way of calling out and asking for help. So when the courts were closed, we still needed to get the information to victims on where they could go to get this help. So regarding protective orders, we needed immediate assistance, and we called on our partner, Clayton Legal Aid, who did not hesitate to assist. Now, we had to work this out because it took a couple of trial and errors for us to figure this out. In magistrate court, on our voicemail website, we had handouts at the courthouse, and we gave information to victims on how to apply for temporary protective orders. Originally, we partnered with the Clayton County Police Department, one of their headquarters, where the victims could be linked to a judge. So we had to become very technologically savvy quickly. And so we began to use Zoom as a way for the victims to access help. And so what they were able to do is through the Clayton County Police Department, they were able to, there was a laptop portal that was right there in the police department. And they were able to access that portal. They could call up Legal Aid, Clayton Legal Aid, and they were connected through the Clayton Legal Aid and the police department. But originally the hours were limited. So what Clayton Legal Aid did they took the initiative to offer assistance to victims. They interviewed them, and I believe they said an 8-hour time frame. And in this 8-hour time frame, Clayton Legal Aid literally interviewed the victims. So by the time we had our hearings via the Zoom for the judges were able to just kind of hone in on the issues that were left that we needed to decide in terms of, just like the ex parte is entering this protective order that gave a protection to the victim that came to seek some type of help that were suffering from domestic violence. And currently the process is much more fluid, and the expertise that Legal Aid is providing is unparalleled. Victims who feel like they suffered in silence, they found a voice and an advocate through our Legal Aid partners.
Thank you, Judge.
Yes, sir.
Obviously, the watchword these days for all of us, but particularly in legal aid and particularly in responding to domestic violence, is innovation and flexibility. Yes. And treating the issue in an urgent way that it demands. We're going to now turn to Sarah, who's also in Georgia. Sarah, how has the coronavirus, we've already heard a bit about it, but how has the coronavirus affected your work and your funding at Georgia, at Atlanta Legal Aid?
Well, we've seen a significant effect, as Judge Dallas was describing. We've essentially had to create or significantly expand our existing projects that serve victims of domestic violence. We have been serving victims through a courthouse project, but we have, in the past, victims have talked to a legal advocate first. Now, we at Legal Aid are the point of entry for survivors, victims who are seeking protection from the courts. So we do provide those consultations. 3 attorneys are on duty all day, excuse me, Monday through Friday, making sure that everybody who applies for assistance receives services from us. We are a nonprofit law firm, so we do have to deal with the possible technicalities of potential conflicts of interest, but we are assisted by a robust team of volunteer attorneys so that we do make sure that everybody receives legal advice, receives some consultation on what to do, make sure everything is done fully and completely before they actually speak to the judge in the ex parte hearing that Katie was describing. We are using a clinic model, which is a brief consultation, typically limited to that one day or possibly a follow-up day if they have to come back. But many of the applicants are also eligible for our ongoing services for continued legal consultations and advice and possible representation. We've seen over 200 people through that program since it started in late March. And in the meantime, we are also seeing an increase in the need for emergency housing because both of the increase in domestic violence, but also, of course, as some of my colleagues have mentioned earlier, the financial pressures mean more people are needing housing right now, and the shelters are full. So our navigators, our resource navigators on staff are also working overtime in conjunction with this project to get as many survivors housed as possible. It is unusual to have lawyers do, at least in the state of Georgia, it's unusual to have lawyers be that first point of contact. That is typically done by a trained social worker that we call a legal advocate. And as a result, there's a particularity in the state funding, which is that the state funding for these domestic violence projects is focused on the second hearing, which is where lawyers traditionally would get involved in Georgia. So we are not seeing coverage from our state funding for this particular type of service. Other types of funding, I think Ron was talking about IOLTA, the interest on lawyer trust accounts funding earlier, that has historically gone down whenever interest rates go down. So for example, in 2008 at Atlanta Legal Aid, we saw a 90% decrease in our IOLTA funding from one year to the next, from over $1 million to about $115,000. This time around, we're forecasting approximately a 70% decrease in that same funding. We're also seeing a projected state budget cut of about 14% for now in Georgia state funding. So we are definitely using a significant amount of our resources in our office, and in the meantime seeing the very real possibility that our ongoing resources are not going to increase to cover those increased hours that our attorneys and our other staff are having to put in to make sure all this work gets done.
Chief Judge Dallas, you've talked about the innovations you've had to try to make. Courts face funding issues just as legal aid programs do. Can you talk about the budget constraints that you're facing or you may be facing?
Absolutely. We've been hit with a lot of challenges, just like other jurisdictions, and we've had to spend money we did not contemplate. By all 8 of our judges had to have desktop computers. We had to have scanners because we have to allow the ability to video conference. We've got to be able to take, to print just an enormous amount of documentation that we previously relied on our assistants to give us. And now that the judges are all home, we've got to do this ourselves, which is fine. We've adapted, but it's just been a lot to get. The IT has to come to the house and set you up. Our judicial assistants have to be given similar hardware. And understand something, that we've got part-time judges that we depend on. And previous to this situation in this environment, our part-time judges were just to help us when we needed a gap to be filled. But now our part-time judges have to work a lot more and more hours are required. And that's an additional expense that we didn't contemplate. So the things that we're spending now, the money that we're spending now is money that was earmarked for a season prior to coronavirus, earmarked for money that we had depended on our previous budgets to determine how much we had to allocate. So, things like going forward even, we've got to configure our courts to allow protection to the general public when they open up. We've got to do the mask, hand sanitizer. We're actually outfitting each courtroom with plastic shields now. So when we do open, we've got to have some source of protection for the public as well as for the court personnel. So the things that you don't really think about that's going to cause a significant economic challenge to opening up, to make sure when we do open up that people are as safe and protected as they are now at home.
Thank you, Judge. As I said, a watchword of this time is flexibility and innovation. In the spirit of flexibility, we're going to take another break in our panel to introduce Congresswoman Debbie Dingell from Michigan. And to do that, we have Father Pius Petrick from our board.
Thank you, Ron. As Ron mentioned, my name is Father Pius Petrick. I serve as the Vice Chair of LSC's Board of Directors. And I have the great pleasure of introducing Congresswoman Debbie Dingell, who for the last 5 years has represented Michigan's 12th district, which stretches from Ann Arbor to West Detroit, my home city, where I was born in Detroit. It was only 6 months ago, back in October of 2019, although it seems like a lifetime ago, given the times that we're in, that we at LSC were gathered in Ann Arbor at the Michigan Advocacy Program's new offices. And I'll say the highlight of that luncheon that afternoon was Congresswoman Debbie Dingell's really rousing address on the need to support legal aid and legal services. But more powerful than her words that day have been her actions in support of legal services in Congress, most notably as co-chair of the Access to Civil Legal Services Caucus. And relevant to our topic today, Congresswoman Dingell shows that same combination of passionate voice and vigorous action in her support of victims of domestic violence, especially women and children. Even before her election to Congress, she founded the Children's Inn at the National Institutes of Health. She co-founded the first Race for the Cures in Michigan and in Washington, D.C. There are few leaders in this country more committed to the cause of legal services and aiding victims of domestic violence than Congresswoman Debbie Dingell. It is therefore my great pleasure to invite her to address the conference this morning. Congresswoman Dingell, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Father. I really appreciate that introduction, and I'm sorry that I'm late to this phone call, but we were doing a delegation meeting worrying about a lot of people. It does seem like it was a long time ago when we were all in Ann Arbor. And the two subjects you're talking today about are two subjects that mean more to me than you will ever know. The day Jim Harbaugh came into my office with John and asked me to be a co-chair of the Legal Services, was a day that really meant a lot. And I've taken it seriously from the moment that they asked. I think too many people don't understand what it's like not to have someone to represent them. Most of us on this video call today, or most of us who are home safe, have access to good legal advice. And there are too many of us too many in our communities that don't have that access. So I take it very seriously to be the advocate for you for full funding in the Congress with my other colleagues, and we'll always do that, because ensuring that every person in this country has representation when they need it is a fundamental right of our Constitution. But you're also talking today, and I'm about to talk to you from my heart, about something that really matters to me, and that's domestic violence. It is a subject that I have always cared about, but was really afraid to talk about for many decades. And I found my voice a few years ago when we were on the House floor doing a sit-in on guns. And for many years, I was embarrassed about what happened in my family. I remember one night when I thought that we would all die, calling the police and the police not answering. And I find myself now, as we are in this stay-at-home order in many states across the country, thinking about what it would have been like if we had all been in that same household that many years ago, and would we have even made it? You know, if you talk to the experts right now, we renewed the Violence Against Women Act more than a year. It's been almost a year and a half. The Senate still hasn't taken it up, and many of these domestic violence centers aren't getting critical funding that they need. And right now, with people in confined spaces, we know that there is an increase of domestic violence. But if you talk to the centers, if you talk to the police department, they're getting fewer calls. And that's because many women, it does happen to men, but most often it's women, are afraid to leave. They don't know how they're going to get by. They don't have financial resources, and they're really afraid for their children. I sometimes look at my mother, and I'm very lucky she's still alive, but my sister and I talk about it more now, not less, and wonder why she stayed. Why did we live in fear? Why were our lives at risk? And in those days, it wasn't only my father who had guns, but she went out and bought a gun to protect us. And we worried about the guns that were every place. Women and children need somebody that'll be there to help them. And as I heard one of the early panelists say, lawyers aren't the typical place that people first go. But you know what? Too many of them don't think that there's anybody to help them. The centers for domestic violence that are in our communities at the grassroots level are there to give them a helping hand, give them a place to stay. But many men have many more resources than women do. They know how to use the courts, and too many are just afraid to leave, that there's no hope, there's no resource. So I am more worried about domestic violence today when we're in these times that women are at home and children are at home. And the kind of violence and the kind of, it's a complicated issue. It's, you know, people suffer from mental health illness. But what we have to do is help people that are in those situations. They don't have to put up with that abuse. They don't have to have their lives threatened. Children don't need to be hit. There are alternatives. So you all play such a critical role in being that helping hand for so many women that don't think that they have any options. So thank you for doing this today. Thank you to everybody that's engaged, from the courts and the judges to law enforcement. You know, domestic violence cases are absolutely the worst cases that law enforcement has to handle. But a lot of women just need help. They need somebody to be there to help them fight for justice for themselves and for their children. And I thank you for being here today and for being there for those that need you, and want to reinforce the importance of legal services to victims of domestic violence and the role that you play. Thank you.
Thank you, Congresswoman Dingell, for those very moving and personal comments, and for being fueled by your experiences in your leadership. We'll go back to our panel now and actually turn to a barrier that most of us don't think about when it comes to domestic violence. But Tiandra, in North Carolina, you have a statewide program, and your lawyers have to work with courts and judges throughout quite a large state. And you've seen local judges make varied decisions about how to work through their court operations during these periods. Can you talk about the challenges the statewide program faces and how you've worked and leveraged your relationship with judges and their staff to try to work through those challenges?
First of all, I would like to thank LSC for shining a spotlight on this issue. As we've heard from other panelists, this is crucial. I would also like to thank the Chief Justice Beasley and Congressman Price for their ongoing support. I have been asked to share some of the early challenges. And although we've heard a lot of the solutions from Chief Justice Beasley, I think it's important for us to remember some of those earlier challenges that can inform things that we can do going forward. And so with that, a lot of my comments will be based on observations shared by my colleagues who, along with their clients, went into uncharted territory by going into these courtrooms in the early stages of this pandemic. As Chief Justice Beasley mentioned, North Carolina ceased operations around mid-March, except for, I think she mentioned, 4 areas, including domestic violence. In the days that followed, both the survivors and my colleagues were very concerned as they entered into these courthouses across the state. Let me just set the stage for you. North Carolina has 100 counties, and each of those counties have at least one courthouse with a very unique culture, if you will. And so in the beginning, beyond signs being posted on the doors that prohibited folks from entering those buildings if they exhibited any kind of COVID-related responses, there was very little happening inside those courtrooms. For example, there was just a lack of sanitation, a lack of any type of social distancing in the courts. in a survey that we gave our attorneys probably in week 3, one of my colleagues reported the following. She said when she arrived to court that day, there were 22 cases on the docket. People were still sitting shoulder to shoulder. For the witnesses who were told to stay in the hallway, they were milling around. There was absolutely no social distancing happening. And the courts at that time were very reluctant to engage in remote hearings. As I've heard from other panelists, there was some kind of remote hearings occurring, and that was at the ex parte level. So that is at that very first stage when people get the emergency hearings for a week, and in our case, for 10 days. Regarding the remote hearing, that has been something that Legal Aid has pushed from the very beginning. It is our hope that we could really decrease the exposure for our clients and ourselves. And so in order to address some of those early concerns, we aggressively start reaching out to our local judges by providing detailed letters that really explain the observations of what was going in court, and also encouraging them to engage in remote hearings. As the Chief Justice mentioned, she had actually ordered that all civil hearings could be held by audio or visual remote platforms. And so with that type of support, we were able to push the needle a little bit. And so in situations where judges would say, you know, we can't handle these type of cases. How do we get in evidence? How would we, you know, utilize witnesses? What we did, we filmed a mock hearing to show how we use the WebEx platform to show how you could hold a hearing. And we use that video for judges to look at. And that really got some traction. A lot of judges reached out, and when they could actually see that in action, it seemed that they were willing to at least move in a positive direction. We also ran into scenarios where people just did not have the equipment. And we decided to look in our stash of laptops and things of that nature. And we actually used our IT department to go to those courthouses and facilitate them obtaining equipment, because it was that important to us, not just for our staff, but for our clients as well. And so now that I mentioned some of those challenges, I would like to say that we have made improvements. In fact, we did a poll this past Friday, and I'm happy to report that conditions at the courthouse have improved. I mean, we still have a ways to go. There are still some areas where social distancing or modeling social distancing by judges or some of the other courthouse would be very helpful. Also, we are happy that remote hearings are becoming more prevalent. However, there is a caveat with that. Although remote hearings are increasing in the family law area, somehow there still seems to be a gap between other family law matters such as temporary custody, divorces, and things of that nature, and domestic violence. And so we're still trying to address that gap. But we are hopeful as these judges become more acquainted with these remote platforms that they will also begin to integrate more of the domestic violence hearings. Because as you guys know, I think there's a long road to go. A lot of us are reopening, and I understand that. But this is an opportunity for us to really work through these type of processes. So if we're hit with this in the future, or if we're dealing with this down the line, that victims have a safer way to access our court. And I want to circle back to something that one of the panelists said in terms of seeing a decrease with our victims initially being accessed to the courts. We saw that too in North Carolina. And because initially a lot of our domestic violence agencies, they either shut down or they significantly curtailed their services. So in response to that, we made posters, we plastered them throughout the community to inform victims that they can contact legal aid directly. Typically, we also got the cases at the permanent hearing stage, but under these conditions, we will take clients at any stage and help them work through the process.
Thank you, Tiandra. Juliana, could you briefly, Tiandra just mentioned outreach to survivors of domestic violence, and we've heard repeatedly how dangerous it can be to seek help while trapped at home. Can you talk about the strategies you've used? Again, if you could do it briefly, that'd be great. Thanks.
Sure. So we use multiple channels to communicate that we are still open and available. Early on, LAFLA installed large banners outside all of our offices with our hotline number. Before the courthouses closed, we posted signs at our court-based domestic violence clinics that we were offering those services remotely through our new domestic violence hotline. And now online matters more. So on social media, we provide key updates about services, resources, and court operations. Our website also provides information to survivors. It still has its emergency exit button, which allows the survivor to instantly leave our website if they are concerned about monitoring and safety. Last year, we started an Adopt a Shelter program to help survivors, especially those in shelters, to help them where they are with transportation, childcare, and safety more difficult now. The program is all the more important. LAFLA also leads the Family Law Coalition of several dozen family law and domestic violence legal services attorneys. By collecting, updating, and publicizing everyone's information, we created a living document of domestic violence legal services resources. We've circulated that to law enforcement, child welfare workers, city and county entities, the media, and the courts, so people are aware of our services. We also train and inform other frontline responders. So recently we trained 400 survivors, frontline service providers, and domestic violence advocates on changes at court and how to pursue a restraining order during the pandemic. 3 times a week, we update domestic violence service providers on the latest about the court and the domestic violence restraining order process. Through that group, we've been able to disseminate information about domestic violence resources at mainstream and ethnic grocery stores and at the public school food distribution centers that distribute roughly 600,000 meals a day. What we've learned from these meetings also informs our own advocacy. So for clients who may have concerns about domestic violence shelters and the shared spaces with other survivors and their children, we're able to explain that shelter options under the pandemic are individual rooms and bathrooms without common spaces. We've also had over 150 pro bono attorneys sign up for remote training on domestic violence restraining orders. My office has also partnered with a local law library to hold virtual clinics, linking low-income survivors to pro bono counsel. We host live events on social media and post all our recorded trainings there. And later this week, we'll be hosting a presentation on stimulus checks and low-income survivors. That was an issue that was highlighted earlier by Congressman Price. So it's been an evolving process, but by staying proactive, we've been able to make progress.
Thank you so much. Chief Judge Dallas, last word in a minute. Can you tell us, in all this challenge and bleakness, are there any silver linings or lessons learned?
I say this to you, Ron Flagg. I think the silver lining in the midst of this environment in this season is what we've begun today. From around the country, we're connecting with each other in real time. And when you're in a stressful situation, people either run away from the problem or work toward a solution. Victims who've already been forced to suffer at home don't have the option of running from the problem. The problem may be right there in their own homes. So we're the ones who've got to create solutions for them. I've seen court personnel in our county become solution seekers. We've had to become technologically savvy in a very short period of time and to adapt new and novel ideas to communicate remotely. And these are going to continue for some time. Legal aid is emerging through this system, like the healthcare professionals, whose value was not totally appreciated until this coronavirus pandemic erupted. And from where I sit literally on the bench, and where I sit remotely in my dining room, the legal aid attorneys have never bowed down from a challenge or backed away from a problem. Ultimately, we as a society have to give voice to the voiceless, and power to those who have suffered in silence for far too long. The coronavirus has simply exposed the unseen faces of victims who find no safety or protection in what we think is a shelter-at-home order.
Thank you so much. And I want to thank all of our panelists today, not just for their remarks and presentations, but for their heroic service in response to the scourge of domestic violence. And it's now my privilege to wrap up our briefing with our concluding speaker, LSC's Leaders Council co-chair, Harriet Myers. Harriet is a partner with the law firm of Locke Lord. She was previously co-managing partner of the firm before she took a detour for government service, including as White House counsel to President George W. Bush. Harriet was the first woman president of both the Texas State and Dallas Bar Associations. When it comes to access to justice and leadership, Harriet Myers is Dr. Yes. When Harriet is asked to speak up for the rule of law and justice for all, her answer is always yes. And that is when she isn't already taking the lead. She is an eloquent, indefatigable, and highly effective advocate for LSC and civil legal aid, exactly the kind of leader we need today. Harriet, thank you for saying yes again and being with us today.
Thank you, Ron, for that very, very wonderful introduction. I appreciate it. You're too generous, but we are very grateful, absolutely grateful for all of our speakers today for sharing their generous and much in demand time with us and their insights and knowledge. It's been a privilege to be able to hear everyone speak, and particularly Congresswoman Dingell. We appreciate your very personal remarks, but everyone who has spoken has done such a great job. And we are addressing critical, incredibly difficult and important and pressing issues all together, as we've heard, in fact, many times life and death issues. So thank each of our speakers for what they have said and all that they do. And I just want to add a few takeaways from our discussions today. We can see why shelter in place is anything but shelter when a spouse is an abuser. We can see how living in fear and too close quarters causes tempers to flare and violence to erupt. We can see why the loss of a job, a car that breaks down, and it's the only means of transportation, or scarcities, just not having the bare necessities to live, can be the last straw, resulting in rage and domestic violence. And the use of the virus itself as a weapon, how despicable the development is that for our society. COVID-19 surely has been an invisible enemy in our midst. exacerbating domestic violence, and also importantly for us to remember sexual assault. Facts make clear how important legal services are in these and similar situations to save a life and help a potential victim. And the absence of those needed legal services we have seen can result in tragedies, life-ending tragedies beyond our true understanding. In normal times, the need for more legal services resources is dire to protect our women and children in harm's way because of violent and deranged persons. As you've heard though, those increased resources are even more needed in the middle of this pandemic, as is true in many disaster situations that we've experienced over the course of time. And food and clothing and housing are admittedly, and everyone understands, bare necessities in our society, but so are legal services to those who need someone to intercede for them and prevent harm to them or even someone taking their life. That's what we need our leaders to understand. That's what we need decision makers to understand, is that these legal resources are bare necessities for those that need them. For example, we are in Texas, I'll just mention a statistic or two in our state. The last report was that the overloaded systems that we already have now seen a 21% rise in calls seeking help from domestic violence in just the month of April. Think about that, 21% increase over the percentages that were talked about at the beginning of unmet needs. These same providers report an increase, interestingly, and again, just emphasizing how pressing these needs are, in extreme and deadly violence on the increase. Recent reports include the killing of a father trying to help his daughter and his grandchildren escape an abuser. As I mentioned earlier, we also have experienced an abuser killing a police officer who was just trying to help, just trying to intervene to help a threatened woman. So in shelters, we talked about shelters, and those are overloaded now to a greater degree, and their ability to be increased in other shelters found in the face of COVID-19 certainly just increased dire needs that can't be met. And these, as we can tell from all these speakers, these are universal problems that are being experienced across our nation. We see that rural areas that don't have resources, and where the abused is able to be in constant scrutiny of those that they would abuse. It is situations that we just haven't faced before until recently. The reduced reporting of sexual assaults is another very saddening development from COVID-19 and its influence. We here in Texas, I'm sure across the nation, the providers are believing that that drop in reports is likely because hospitals are not allowing the victim advocates to accompany the survivors into the hospital. There's an increased fear by those who are victims of even going to a hospital because of fear of the virus. And and with the increased isolation, we are seeing the perpetrators simply having more ability to control those they intend and do abuse. All tragic circumstances. So our providers in Texas and elsewhere are straining and working double time to try to protect the vulnerable. But the efforts of program participants today are, they're just our heroes and our heroines. And They're also trying to encourage volunteer help, but adequate funding for legal service providers is most needed for effectively stopping abusive conduct and the maiming or killing of victims. And we are appreciative of all the work that's being done here, but it's a never-ending demand for resources that in our nation, sadly, we do not have. So I especially thank the members of our Leaders Council who have been so great. Jim Harbaugh was mentioned earlier in remarks. You've been a potent support for the Legal Services Corporation and its needs. We're greatly indebted to you, and we thank all of those viewing who care enough to spend this amount of time to listen to these issues and understand them better. We are indebted to you. And I thank the planners of the program and our speakers. And I, as always, thank John Levy and the Board of Legal Services Corporation. They are great leaders. And thank you all for being here to listen. Here, I'll put in quotes, but I'll end by saying, God bless America and all of our frontline workers in this pandemic, all of our first responders, and always our servicemen and women around the world facing unusual and difficult circumstances because of this virus. So thank you, Ron, for having me, and keep up the great work.